There we go. Okay. All right. Well, good morning, and welcome to our second session on reading the Gospel of Matthew. Um, there are a handful of faces here that were not here on Wednesday. Um, there's just no way that I can go over all of that stuff. I can just briefly touch on some of it, but I encourage you to go back and look at the other teaching. Um, I'm concerned that there's a lot of material that needs to be covered. But I mean Matthew is much bigger than Mark. Matthew has 28 chapters. Mark has 16. And last time we spent 2 sections on a 16 chapter Mark. We're spending 2 sections on a 28 chapter Matthew. So
yeah, and Dustin, if you don't get to it all today, that's okay. We'll do a
We'll
part.
continue.
We'll do another part.
Well, I'm my point is, like, I can't just go back and, like, as much as I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page, I physically can't do that today. So by that I mean going back and looking at everything that we did on Wednesday. So I'll be able to touch on a couple of things, and of course at the conclusion I'll be able to wrap a lot of things up. But what I'd like to be able to do is in a slightly different fashion, the way that I normally speak. I actually would like to go through all of the content first and hold off answering questions or clarifying things until the end. So if you do have a question, just jot down a little note, write it down. You don't want to think, oh, I want to ask that question, and then 20 minutes later you're like, oh, I forgot what that question is, because I want to help you. So just be a little patient with me. And we'll hopefully be able to cover a lot of material here. So, okay, so we are looking at how to study the Gospel of Matthew, and of course this is the second session on that. So I'm going to skip most of the stuff that we've done on Wednesday, and I'm going to start here actually on this slide, which was the slide that we ended on. I think we may have ended on the one prior to that. So, okay, it's important for us to really try to discern the original audience, because by discerning the original audience, we can understand why Matthew was writing. We can understand the distinctives that he wanted to add. We can help understand his intention and his purpose, because if we use Matthew in a way that was different than God inspired for it to be used, then we're really misusing it. And so there are a lot of clues that we have to look at in order to discern this original audience, their circumstance, and it'll help bring to light a lot of Matthew's emphases that are extremely important, that in a frustrating way often get overlooked by people that just aren't on the lookout for this sort of evidence. So 5 points here. And okay, good, I moved that to the bottom. All right, so Matthew, number one, Matthew shows a considerably heightened conflict between Jesus and his opponents when compared to Mark. We're going to see this. In particular, we got Matthew chapter 23 is an extremely long denunciation against the scribes and the Pharisees, and the Pharisees appear as the primary antagonists to Jesus in Matthew. So the first thing that I notice in Matthew is that Matthew seems to be much more in debate, much more in conflict, and much more on the attack and defense against the Pharisees. And so you can look at this. This is just a bar graph of how many times the word Pharisees show up in the New Testament, actually really in the entire Bible. So you can see there Matthew shows up 29 times, Luke shows up 27, John shows up 20, Mark 12, Acts 9, and Philippians it shows up once. But compared to Mark was our first gospel, Mark had 12 and Matthew has 29. And that's a massive upgrade from there. It's almost as if Matthew is taking Mark and he's saying, let me highlight to you the fact that it's the Pharisees who are the opponents of Jesus. And so his emphasis is actually increasing the exposure of the Pharisees as the opponents by 141%. And that, just by looking at the chart there, it just jumps off the chart. And I also pointed out on Wednesday that Matthew, statistically speaking, is actually not even the longest gospel. Luke actually has more words and verses. So even though Matthew is really the second largest gospel, strictly from a size standpoint, it actually has the highest emphasis on the Pharisees being the opponents of Jesus. But my point is, I want you to look at Mark and I want you to look at Matthew there. You go from 12 to 29, and that's a massive jump. So to where Mark, it was just kind of like, okay, Jesus has some opponents. They just generally seem to be various Jews who don't believe in him. But Matthew, it's very clear that he is making the point. He is emphasizing it, and he's hammering it extensively that it's the Pharisees, the Pharisees, the Pharisees. They are the opponents of Jesus. And so that's a massive emphasis. And so I'm curious why that is the way that it is. Okay. So, all right. So if Mark was written in the late 60s, which is what we argued when we looked at Mark, and if the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in the year 70, then the date of Matthew's composition could be indicative of a conflict between the followers of Jesus on one side and the Pharisaic leadership of Judaism after the temple's destruction. What I mean by that is that after the temple was destroyed in the year 70, okay, then there are a lot of different Jewish groups and a lot of different Jewish sects that just cease to be. They just cease to exist, okay? And we are aware of four primary Jewish groups, four primary Jewish sects within Judaism. That's the Pharisees are number one, the Sadducees are number two, the Zealots are number three, and the Essenes are number four. Very quickly, Pharisees are those like Paul. They are popular with the crowds. They have a lot of they don't have authority in themselves that was granted by really anyone in Judaism, but they were popular teachers in the crowds. They were well trained, and their name Pharisees comes from the Hebrew word parashim, which means separate ones, which means that they were highly interested in ritual purity. And so you'll see a lot of the conflicts between Jesus and the Pharisees deal with issues of how you interpret ritual purity. Okay, Sadducees, they were the ones that were the rich priestly aristocracy that had their power structure in the temple, and they were kind of the Jews that kind of said, well, if you can't beat the Romans, let's join them. And so they would collaborate with the Romans and hoard all of the power to themselves, and all of their power was involved in the temple. So of course, when the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees had zero power, so they just kind of ceased to be. The Zealots are those that say, we're not going to join the Romans. This is our land that God gave us, and we're going to fight back and start a revolution and be zealots and bandits and political revolutionaries. The best example of those are the persons that were crucified next to Jesus. We also have Barabbas, who was called an insurrectionist. There was even a zealot among the 12 apostles, and I imagine that being around Jesus made him repent of that tendency very quickly. And then you have the Essenes, about which the New Testament says nothing, but we actually know more about them than any of the other Jewish groups, because they're the groups that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so we have hundreds and hundreds of their documents, and we know quite a lot about them. We know that they were the ones that lived out in Qumran, which is a community by the Dead Sea Scroll, a community by the Dead Sea. They took up arms against Rome when Rome was attacking in the Jewish war between 66 and 70. But Rome marched into their community and wiped them all out and burnt out most of their community. We know this because archaeologists have discovered coins that can be dated to the year 68 with massive burn marks on it in the Qumran community, in the Dead Sea Scroll community. And so that's when we know that they died, because that's when they know that they were burnt out. So point being is that after the year 70, the only people that were left over to be the heirs of Judaism, to be the new interpreters of Judaism, were the Pharisees. And they became what some people call Pharisaic Judaism. Some people call it Rabbinic Judaism because it's based on the rabbis. And so they are the ones, after the destruction of the temple, who have control of the steering wheel of Judaism, and they are going to direct it wherever they want to go. Okay. So the point is, Mark was written in the late 60s. If Matthew's using Mark as a source and we're seeing that there's a conflict between the Pharisees, it seems like Matthew is being written to address a conflict between the followers of Jesus on one hand and the new heirs of Judaism after the destruction of the temple on the other hand. Okay. And so Matthew's gospel is going to reflect those particular conflicts. Okay. This point number 3 is the point that I really, really, really want to stress. I can't emphasize that enough. Okay. We must also remember that one of the common characteristics in Greco-Roman biographies is polemical arguments. Polemical arguments. If you do not know what polemical means, let me explain it for you. And if you still don't understand, please go look it up in a dictionary. We will use the word polemical quite a lot when we're studying Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Primarily Matthew and John. Okay, to be polemical means that you're basically you're debating and you're fighting and you're arguing. Okay, that's what it means. It's arguments that are, you are debating very strongly. Okay, polemical just really means, it almost means like war or fighting or battle. So what is a polemical argument? That is the ordering of the biography where the subject, that's Jesus, he argues and debates with opponents with the intended purpose of persuading readers to adopt the position of the hero, that's Jesus, and to reject the position of the antagonist. Who are the antagonists in Matthew's gospel? That's very clearly the Pharisees, okay? So, if Matthew is written with this purpose being it's a deliberate polemical argument, and I talked about when we were looking at what are gospels and how gospels were Greco-Roman biographies, that sometimes they can exhibit polemical tendencies, and those polemical tendencies become primary interpretive lenses through which we have to understand the original author. Then we need to take very seriously what's actually taking place here. But the point of the polemic is ultimately to persuade us as readers. That's the point. The point is to get us to side with Jesus and to have nothing to do with the antagonist. That's the way if you read Matthew from cover to cover, if you pick it up today and read for, I think it takes about 3 hours to read Matthew out loud from chapter 1, verse 1 to 28, verse 20. You will become very convinced that, wow, I need to follow Jesus, and I want to have nothing to do with the Pharisees. Okay. Furthermore, the polemical emphasis seems to have shaped Mark's core in a way to speak specifically to Matthew's intended audience. And so I try to put a little diagram on the bottom to make this point, is that, okay, so what happened in history? In history, where Jesus was there, okay, so the historical Jesus had debates with the historical Pharisees. We know that. We all see that. You can see that actually in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Okay, that's something we all understand, we all agree on, okay? But the way that the original readers would have understood this, because remember, they knew that these Gospels were meant to be applied to their lives, and they were written specifically to persuade them in their behavior. What Matthew's original audience would have done, notice how Matthew's audience is directly under the historical Jesus. They would have sided and associated themselves and would have put themselves in the shoes with Jesus, because Matthew's audience is in a debate currently with the Pharisaic leadership of Jerusalem. And Matthew's audience has said, oh, we know who those Pharisaic leaders are. They're the ones that are these Pharisees that were historically arguing with Jesus. So you see how Matthew is written to where it says, okay, Jesus was arguing against Pharisees, and thereby you, Matthew's original audience, you need to read this and kind of align yourself with Jesus and kind of compare the Pharisees that Jesus was arguing with the Pharisees that you're arguing with, and thereby take the position that Jesus did and ignore the position that those Pharisees had. And so it's kind of reading yourself into the story and connecting yourself with those particular persons. And we get this. We do this today. Anybody, I mean, goodness, unless you're living under a rock, there's a pretty massive superhero movie that's been released this weekend, and it's going to break tons and tons of records. Why? Because lots of people like to associate themselves with their favorite hero. That's how a lot of literature works, and it's been very effective because we're still writing and using that sort of literature today. Okay. Still looking at discerning original audience. This is a little more complicated. I'm not going to make a big point of it, but this is kind of where scholarship stands as of today. This is a modern critical scholarship in the year 2018. So we see that those Christians that fled Jerusalem during the Jewish War, you need to know the Jewish War, this is the war where Rome was attacking Jerusalem. That happened from the year 66 to 70. Remember, at 70, that's when Rome destroyed the Jerusalem temple. And so Jesus actually told them, he says, when you see these things take place, you're to flee, you're to run. So those Christians who fled Jerusalem during the Jewish war would likely relocate to a sizable community of believers. Okay, that makes sense. If you're going to run away, where are you going to go? I mean, where are you going to live? You're going to live somewhere that seems safe, that seems familiar, and so we can make some guesses as to where this is. Most scholars of Matthew have suggested that Syria in the north, namely the city of Antioch, okay, so we got Syria and Antioch, would be the most likely candidate since there was already a prominent church there. We know in Galatians chapter 2, verse 11, that Syrian Antioch was a church that had been there for decades before. We know that Peter had visited there. We know that Paul had visited there. And we know that that church had believing Jews and Gentiles. We can see this from Paul's own writings. So I put there that the church in Antioch had believing Jews and Gentiles in addition to having the largest population of Jews in the diaspora. What is the diaspora? The diaspora is the area outside of Palestine, is anywhere in the world that is outside of Palestine, outside of the Holy Land. That's what they call the diaspora. It's just another word for the dispersion. Really, it's the word for the spreading of seed. Okay. Syria was the location of the late 1st century, early 2nd century Bishop Ignatius. It's a famous church father named Ignatius who lived there in Syria. And he was one of the first church fathers to write under the clear influence of Matthew. You can read Ignatius. We're not going to do that today, but it's very clear that he was heavily influenced by Matthew. So the point is, most scholars have said, okay, if these people are under attack, if their way of life is under threat in Jerusalem and they're going to leave somewhere, where are they going to go? Syria seems a very likely place because we know that Matthew was a heavily used gospel there based on one of its earliest exponents. We know there's a church there that had been there for decades. It was established. It was a church that had believing Jews and Gentiles. It had a large Jewish community, and we know that it was, I would say, within reasonable distance. I mean, depending on your definition of reasonable. So most people today, most scholars of Matthew, think that Matthew's original audience was written to a Christian community in Syria. And probably more specifically in Syrian Antioch. I say Syrian Antioch because there are like 3 or 4 different cities in the Greco-Roman world named Antioch, named after Antiochus, and most people don't distinguish them. So they need to be distinguished. There's different Antiochs. So this is Syrian Antioch. Anyway, so that's your history lesson for today. Okay, and lastly, in regarding to audience. Keep trying to move this thing. Okay. It appears most likely that Matthew wrote his gospel to a community in Syria consisting of believing Jews and Gentiles in order to heighten discipleship against the teachings of the heirs of Judaism after the temple's destruction, namely the Pharisees. Okay. Probably the most important thing I want you to get out of all that is that Matthew's got a heightened emphasis on the Pharisees being the opponents of Jesus. And therefore, it's likely that Matthew is forming and shaping his gospel for his community, who is in direct debate, combat, argument, dialogue, whatever you want to call it, with these people that are claiming to be the true heirs of Judaism after the temple's destruction, namely the Pharisees, who become the heirs and the teachers of rabbinical Judaism. Okay. Deep breath here. Okay, Matthew's emphases. Here's where we start having some fun. I'm just going to put this out on the side. All right. Okay, so I'm asking this kind of question here, kind of like if what would it be? What would I do if I were a particular person? If I were a post 70 AD Pharisee, and I wanted to argue that Pharisaical Judaism was the true heir, and that Christian claims were false, what would I say? I would argue that Jesus was not the legitimate Messiah, and that us Pharisees were more authentic interpreters of the law than the followers of Jesus are. Okay? So therefore, we should note how Matthew seeks to highlight Jesus in two important ways. Okay? Again, so I'm hypothetically thinking here. If I wasn't a Christian around the end of the first century, and as a Jew, I wanted to argue that my understanding of Judaism was right, and that the Christian understanding of Judaism was wrong, what would I say? Well, you could see in the New Testament the kind of things that they say. They never say, well, Jesus didn't exist. They never say that, because they all know that he existed. They say, well, he was a false Messiah, or he was a false Christ, or he led people astray, or sometimes he was accused of having a demon. Or they would say, oh, Jesus, he didn't take the law seriously. He was a bad interpreter of the law. He wasn't acting as a righteous, holy Jew who was interested in purity. Okay, so we're going to see that Matthew, on my hypothesis, is writing to counter these things. So Matthew highlights Jesus in two particular ways. He tries to argue that Jesus is the true Messiah rather than any sort of messianic pretender or any sort of person that is demon possessed. So we're going to see in Matthew that there's this heightened emphasis. Jesus is the Messiah, and they're going to use all these different titles of him. You know, he is the son of David. He is the son of God. He is the son of Abraham. Okay? And he's not a messianic pretender, and he's certainly not demon possessed. But we're going to see one particular time where we have the Pharisees who they can't deny the fact that Jesus is doing miracles. So their only argument is, oh, he's doing miracles under the power of Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons. You see how that works? Like that's their argument. Their argument is, Jesus exists. We see that. He's doing miracles. We can't deny that. We don't believe that God is working in him because he can't be God's Messiah. So how is he doing these miracles? He has to be getting his power from the devil. So that's what they're arguing. And then we see that Jesus taught in Matthew, and his disciples follow the true meaning of the law. Okay, and it should be noted that early Christians regarded themselves as the fulfillment and the climax of Judaism. And I just picked a variety of places in the New Testament to where we see Paul and James make those particular arguments. We're not going to look at those. That's just kind of more for your notes. And if you don't screenshot right now, and if you don't write all those down, that's okay. You can look at the video later and pause it and write those down. But it's very clear that the New Testament authors regarded themselves and regarded the Christian faith as the fulfillment and the climax of what Judaism was aiming at, although it was very clear that there were non-believing Jews as a separate group. So these are believers. The believers saw themselves as the fulfillment of the law and the fulfillment of Judaism. But Matthew's trying to make that point against his opponents. Remember the opponents? The Pharisees. The Pharisees they think that they're the true heirs of Judaism. They want to discount Jesus. So Matthew is trying to write to a community in the midst of this debate and this dialogue to say, no, Jesus is the true Messiah. You can make that argument, audience of Matthew, and that Jesus is not someone who just haphazardly doesn't care about the law. No, Jesus was a good interpreter of the law. And in fact, the Christian church is the fulfillment and climax of Judaism, which means that the Pharisees, by definition, are not the heirs of Judaism. Moving along. Okay, so we're going to see here that one of the primary emphases in Matthew's gospel is that Jesus is the new Moses. Jesus is the new Moses. This is a major emphasis in Matthew's gospel that Mark does not use. Okay? Now, why would Matthew need to emphasize that Jesus is the new Moses over Mark? It's very clear, because Matthew is in dialogue with these post-70 AD Pharisees who think that they are the true heirs of Judaism. Where did Judaism descend from? Judaism descended from Moses. Okay, so who would be the true interpreter of Moses? Well, if Jesus is the new Moses, then that would make the followers of Jesus the true heirs. So there's going to be this major emphasis here in Matthew. So let's look at this. Okay. Here is where I'm going to politely request somebody do some reading for me. Okay. May I have a volunteer to read Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15, and then verses 18 through 19. And for the rest of you, if you do not have these verses underlined in your Bible or highlighted in your Bible, please go do it right now. These are important verses. These are refrigerator verses for the rest of your life. Who is my volunteer today? Don't make me pick on you.
I'll read it.
Okay.
Where is it again?
It's Deuteronomy 18, verses 15, and then verses 18 through 19. So chapter 18, and then 15, 18, 19.
Okay. Gosh, this is the print on this Bible is really small. 15, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him. This is what you requested from the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly when you said, let us not continue to hear the voice of the Lord our God or see this great fire any longer so that we will not die. And then keep going.
Just make sure you get 18 and 19. That's kind of the climax.
Okay. Then the Lord said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. I will hold accountable whoever does not listen to my words that he speaks in my name. But the prophet who dares to speak a message in my name is that going too far?
You got the Bible in front of you. I don't, so I'm trusting.
Well, I'm just remembering what you...
19.
Okay. The problem is that the print is so small, I'm having trouble seeing it. I think I read it all.
Okay, all right. The point of that verse is that the person who is the you in that is Moses, okay? So God is saying in Deuteronomy 18, this is extremely important for us. God is saying, I'm going to raise up a prophet like Moses from among your people, from among your brothers, from among your countrymen. And then verse 18, God says, I'm going to put my words in this prophet's mouth. And anybody who doesn't listen to this prophet, I'm going to call him to account, because this prophet is going to speak the very words of God. But this prophet, it says in both verse 15 and verse 18, he is a prophet like Moses. He's a prophet like you, and that you there is Moses in the context, okay? So in Deuteronomy 18, I just remember it as 18:18. That's just the easiest way to do it. It states that God will raise up a prophet like Moses, and the people are required to listen to him, okay? So Moses was the person who basically, in the Old Testament, was the interpreter of the law. He was the one that had the final say-so as to what God's law and God's instruction meant. But we have this prophecy here in Deuteronomy 18 that at some point in history, God is going to raise up another prophet like Moses, and you guys need to listen to him. He's going to have the authority of Moses. In fact, his authority is going to be higher because God himself is going to put his authoritative words in the mouth of this prophet, okay? And prior to the birth of Jesus, nobody in Judaism claimed to be this prophet like Moses, okay? Now, the book of Acts makes it very clear that this is Jesus. The book of Acts tells us this in Acts chapter 3 and in Acts chapter 7, okay? But we're going to see that Matthew also believes this, and Matthew has its own way of arguing that Jesus is the prophet promised from Deuteronomy 18:18. So, Jesus is the fulfillment of this promise, and Matthew argues that Jesus is the new Moses and thereby possesses the authority that requires obedience. That makes sense, because again, if Matthew is writing to his community after the year 70 that is dialoguing with these Pharisees that claim to be the true heirs and interpreters of Judaism, Matthew wants to say, actually, Jesus is the new Moses, so Jesus is really the heir of all these things, and the followers of Jesus are the true disciples, and they're the true and faithful people of God. So part of doing this is to make the point that Jesus is the new Moses, and that would trump any claims of anybody else. Okay, the opening words of Matthew are a clear echo to the opening of the first of Moses's books. We usually call the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In the history of Judaism, those were attributed to Moses. And you probably can't read this, but in Matthew chapter 1, I got a little chart here, and you can see there are these quoted words here that are highlighted. And so in Matthew 1:1, you have this word, which really means it's biblos geneseos, which is the word for the book of the genealogy, or the scroll of the genealogy. And what I did is I just highlighted those, and I just did search. And you see that also shows up at the beginning of Genesis chapter 2 and the beginning of Genesis chapter 5. And so anybody reading Matthew chapter 1 in the Greek who was familiar with the Greek Old Testament would have said, oh, okay, this is already drawing upon those books that were written, that were attributed to Moses. Sorry. And so there seems to be already this deliberate parallel to those passages. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4 is the beginning of the second creation story. It gets translated a little more fluidly. Genesis chapter 5 is actually the genealogy that's there. Of course, Matthew chapter 1 is also a genealogy. But those are the point is, if you do a word study or a search on those first 2 words in Matthew 1:1, these are the only 2 other places where it's going to show up. The point is, Matthew seems to deliberately drawing attention and echoing these first books of Moses as kind of the beginnings of this new creation. How else is Jesus described as a new Moses? We see the infant Jesus was spared from the attempted murder of Herod, just as Moses was saved from the attempted murder of Pharaoh. I think this has been observed by a lot of people, that when you look at the birth story of Jesus that Matthew has, remember, Mark does not have a genealogy. Mark does not have a birth narrative. Matthew has access to those things. But we see that Jesus was as a baby, as an infant, was about to be killed by this murderous king, just like Moses was about to be killed by this murderous king. Okay? So I think those parallels are very strong. And so that's another reason why Matthew would want to add that material to Mark, because Mark just did not have access to that material. But that's anyone reading that story of Matthew and the birth of Jesus, in the birth of Matthew, is would draw the comparisons there with the birth of Moses. What else do we see here in regard to Jesus, the new Moses? We see that this is another one of the most important things I want to say. All right. So Matthew organizes his gospel into 5 blocks of teaching, each ending with the phrase, when Jesus had finished these. Sometimes it's sayings, sometimes it's words, sometimes it's parable, but it's when Jesus had finished these, quote, quote, sayings. And he does it at the end of these 5 different blocks of teachings, okay? Actually, what I'd like to do, just to be thorough, I'd like to get a volunteer to read these 5 passages so that we can see here how Matthew is deliberately organizing and shaping his gospel account, okay? So I can get one person to read these 5 references, please.
I will.
Okay, thank you.
Matthew 7:28. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Okay. 11:1. When Jesus had finished giving instructions to his 12 disciples, he departed from there to teach and preach in their cities.
Okay. Next one's 14:53.
14. Matthew 14:53. I don't think that's right.
Did I make
yeah, it doesn't go. There isn't a verse 53. I don't.
Okay.
It just goes to verse 36. Maybe 13.
That's what it is. It's 13.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. 13:53. When Jesus had finished these parables, he departed from there.
Okay, next one is 19, verse 1.
Okay. 19 verse 1. When Jesus had finished these words, he departed from Galilee and came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan.
Okay, and the last
And
one
then-
is in chapter 26 and verse 1.
When Jesus had finished all these words, he said to his disciples.
Okay, yeah, so sorry about my mistake there. I apologize and beg for your
Oh my gosh, you made a mistake. Can't
Okay.
believe it.
I did fix it. I did fix it there. Okay, so very clear there. We have this continued phrase when Jesus had finished these sayings, words, teachings, parables. And notice the last one ends at the beginning of chapter 26. Okay, just keep that in mind. Okay, now after these 5 blocks of teachings, Jesus speaks of the blood of the covenant. Okay, in chapter 26. Okay, so actually, if I can get somebody, maybe someone else, to kind of share the load here. Can somebody read Matthew 26 and verse 28?
I'll read it.
Okay.
For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sin. But I say to you, I will not. Okay, you just 28. Is that it?
Yes, ma'am.
Should I? Okay, so that's it, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So after this, he speaks about the blood of the covenant. Okay. Now I'm going to argue that this is a clear echo of the 5 books of Moses. Okay. Jesus has 5 blocks of teaching. Moses has 5 books. Okay. And Moses's commandments were also sealed with the blood of the covenant. And if I can get somebody to read Exodus chapter 24, verses 7 through 8. Okay.
Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words.
Yep. With all these words. Okay. So there in Exodus, Moses had recounted the terms of the covenant, the terms of the Mosaic covenant. And he read to the people, and all the people said, hey, all the things that the Lord has said, we're going to do. And what he does is he sprinkles upon them the blood of the covenant to seal that agreement, to seal that treaty, to seal that pact, you would say. And so, in other words, Matthew seems to regard the teachings of Jesus as the stipulations for the new covenant, sealed and confirmed with Jesus' death. Okay, so my point there is that Matthew deliberately organizes his gospel into 5 blocks of teaching, which right afterwards are sealed with the blood of the covenant, namely Jesus' death. Just like Moses had 5 blocks of teaching that were sealed with the blood of the covenant. And so this makes it very clear that Jesus in Matthew is being portrayed as the new Moses, on top of the fact of saying what I think is very obvious, that the teachings of Jesus are a part of the new covenant. So this is not something that this is something that nearly every single modern Matthew commentary observes. This is not something that I just made up last night. Like lots and lots of scholars see and observe this particular point. So, but to me, that all it does is it continues to demonstrate that Matthew is deliberately organizing his gospel to portray Jesus as the new Moses. And of course, for us, it makes the teachings of Jesus very important for us because they are the terms of the new covenant. Okay, what else can we see on Jesus as the new Moses? We see that there appears to be a rather obvious allusion to Moses when Jesus went onto the mountain and offered instructions to the people of God. Okay, these references are in Matthew. Can I have somebody read Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 2, please?
I'll read it. Oh, go ahead.
Chapter 5, 1 through 2. Now when he saw the crowds, he went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying,
Yep. Okay. Jesus went on a mountain and he started to teach people. Who else in the Old Testament went on a mountain to teach people the instructions of God? That's obviously Moses. I mean, that's pretty clear. Moses did his ascend. Also, we see at the end of the Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus descends from the mountain. And we don't have to go back and read this, but when Jesus descended from the mountain in Matthew chapter 8 and verse 1, it actually quotes the same Greek of Moses descending from the mountain in Exodus chapter 32 and verse 15. We don't have to read that. I'm just kind of putting that there for your notes. The point is Matthew seems to be identifying Jesus as the new teacher on a mountain, giving the instructions of God. And you have to remember that the word, which it gets translated in the New Testament as law, but in the Old Testament just means instruction. It means like instruction. Torah is like, hey, go do this instead of doing that. That's what it means. So we got a new Moses teaching the new instruction of God. He's on a new mountain. I mean, there's just a lot of references there to Jesus being the new Moses. Okay. On the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus's face, quote, shone like the sun. That's the past tense of shine. Okay. Just like the description of Moses on the mountain in Exodus chapter 34 and verse 30. We know that Moses' face also shone because they had to cover it with a veil. Okay. So we got both of these people that are on a mountain. They come into contact with God in some sort of special way, and they are shining because of it there. Furthermore, the summons from God and Matthew's readers to, quote, listen to him there in the event of the Transfiguration seems to again affirm the connection with Deuteronomy 18:18, where we read earlier that God is going to put his words into the mouth of this prophet, and whoever does not listen to him, God's going to call him to account. So let's actually read, if somebody could read these two verses at the Transfiguration in chapter 17. Somebody can read chapter 17, this is in Matthew, chapter 17, verses 2 and 5, please.
I will. Verse 2, he was transformed in front of them, and his face shone like the sun. Even his clothes became as white as the light. Verse 5, while he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son. I take delight in him. Listen to him."
Right. Listen to him. God the Father does not speak much in Matthew's gospel. He speaks at the baptism of Jesus, and he speaks here. So listening to Jesus, if God doesn't say much, but if he says listen to Jesus, we better do that. But the point is, come on, who is the person in the Bible that shone like the sun and had the authority? That's Moses, and we also see that was Jesus. Okay. I'm just trying to make this case that when I look at Matthew, he seems to very deliberately want to make the argument that Jesus is the new Moses. Again, why is this important? Why is this not in Mark? I think Mark would probably would say that he agrees with these things, but Mark's audience didn't need to hear these emphases. Matthew's audience did, because Matthew's audience is in debate and dialogue with the Pharisees, who claim to be the true heirs and interpreters of Judaism. But Matthew is trying to say, no, Jesus is the true heir and interpreter of Judaism, and thereby the followers of Jesus are those who are being faithful to God's law and God's instruction. Okay, we all know this. Anybody reading through Matthew will see that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures, Israel's scriptures. Okay, like dozens of times it says, and Jesus did this to fulfill the prophecy that said X, Y, and Z. So a couple of these we could read. Probably don't want to read all of them. Matthew seems highly interested in depicting Jesus as the goal and climax of Israel's scriptures, likely a stress intended to reassure readers who are in debates with the post-70 AD Pharisaic leadership, claiming that they were the true interpreters and heirs of Judaism. Okay. The one here, let's see, we can, let me see how many I have here. 10. Okay. How are we doing on our time? Okay, let's not read all of them. Let's pick a couple of them. The first one is the Emmanuel one, which is a prophecy involving that God is still going to be with the people. Let's do this one. Let's do the one in chapter 2 and verse. I'll call on a volunteer here, but I want this volunteer to be someone who's comfortable reading about 4 of these. So make sure you understand what you are agreeing to if you're volunteering. So if this volunteer, whomever it is, could they read Matthew chapter 2 and verse 15?
I'll read it.
Okay.
Matthew chapter 2 and verse 15.
Please.
Says, he stayed there until Herod's death, so that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son.
Right. Okay. Where it says he stayed there, that means he stayed there in Egypt. Okay. Because he wanted to fulfill what Hosea said, out of Egypt I have called my son. It's very important that we understand what Matthew is doing with this and what Hosea was doing with this. Okay. Because in Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, out of which this is being quoted, Hosea is referencing the nation of Israel coming out of Egypt in the book of Exodus. We know this because that's what happened. That's why we call that book the Exodus. Okay. But in Hosea chapter 11 verse 1, son, out of Egypt I've called my son, refers to the nation of Israel as the Son of God. And that's how that particular thing is being used. Okay. But when Matthew is using it, he doesn't refer to the nation of Israel. He refers to Jesus as the Son. That's very important, is that Matthew is using it in a more distinct and Christological way, because he thinks that, let's take a passage of Israel as a nation being the Son of God, and let's quote it in reference to Jesus. Why does he do that? Because he believes that Jesus is the embodiment of the nation of Israel. That's very important. Okay? So that quotation is not just a quotation to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. It's a quotation that tells us what being the Messiah entails. Okay? And the Messiah is the king that represents his people. That's what it is. Remember when David sinned in the Old Testament because he made the census, and because of David's sin, the people had to suffer the punishment because the king represents his people. Anyway, so you could actually say that Matthew thinks that Jesus is the embodiment of Israel. If you're comfortable using the word incarnation of Israel, that's fine. It's just another way of saying he's the human embodiment of something. But that's interesting there that Matthew's using that. So again, Hosea 11:1 is about Son of God being the nation of Israel, but when it gets quoted of Jesus in Matthew 2:15, it refers to Jesus being the Son of God, because Jesus is the Son that represents the nation of Israel as Israel's Messiah. Okay, let's see. What else do we want to look at? Okay, let's do the one in chapter 8 and verse 17, please.
Chapter 8 and verse 17. So that what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled, he himself took our weaknesses and carried our diseases.
Right. So that's a passage out of Isaiah chapter 53, which is the passage of Jesus as the suffering servant who ultimately dies for the sins of the world. But actually gets quoted here in the middle of the ministry of Jesus, prior to his death, when Jesus is healing diseases and sicknesses. Okay, so even just the basic things that Jesus does, even the minute details of Jesus' ministry, Matthew wants to portray as fulfillment of Scripture. So Jesus taking upon sins and sicknesses is something that he does all throughout his ministry, not just on the day of his death. Okay, let's see. How about the one here in chapter 12, verses 17 through 21?
12, 17 through 21. So that what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled, here is my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul delights. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not argue or shout, and no one will hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed, and he will not put out a smoldering wick. Until he has led justice to victory, the nations will put their hope in his name.
Yeah, very interesting there. It's God is promising to put his spirit upon this particular servant. And twice there, it says, in him the Gentiles or the nations are going to hope. And he's going to proclaim justice to these nations. The word for nations is the word Gentiles there. Very interesting that Matthew wants to regard Jesus preaching to Gentiles as the fulfillment of Scripture. Very important for us as we're going to later look. We're going to later see emphases in Matthew's gospel about this. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. You can do the one in 26:56.
Chapter 26, verse 56. But all this has happened so that the prophetic scriptures would be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and ran away.
Yeah, there he doesn't actually tell us what those scriptures are. They're just kind of unspecified, but it demonstrates that the arrest of Jesus was done in fulfillment of Scripture. So the point is, Matthew has this major emphasis that this was done in fulfillment of the Scriptures, okay? We don't see this in Mark's gospel, okay? Now, Mark surely believed that Jesus was the fulfillment of Scripture. I think that we could agree on that. But Matthew wants to make this emphasis over and over and over and over and over again, and that emphasis is not in Mark. Why does Matthew have to do this? Because, again, his audience is debating with people who think that they're the true heirs and interpreters of Judaism. But Matthew's trying to say, no, Jesus is that person because all the scriptures point to him. We need to appreciate the fact that this is a distinctly Matthean argument. That's the way of saying things associated with Matthew is Matthean. Anyway, so that's I think that's all the references where the quotations show up in Matthew. If I missed one, well, too bad, it wouldn't have fit on the slide. So that's the 10 you're going to get. Okay. All right. How about emphasis on Jesus being the true Son of God? Now, let's remember, before we look at this, let's remember in Mark's gospel, okay, did the disciples know that Jesus was the Son of God? Did they make that confession? Yes, no, maybe. In Mark's gospel, we saw there was a distinct attitude. Remember, Mark's gospel began by saying, Jesus, here's the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And it ended with the centurion saying, truly, this man is the Son of God. Okay? Now, the disciples understand that Jesus was the Son of God in Mark's gospel?
Well, yeah. In his gospel, did they say something about that?
Yeah. Were they the ones that made the confession?
No, I don't think that's...
Yes, we looked at it. Yeah, when we looked at the gospel of Mark, in every single occurrence of the phrase Son of God, it was not the disciples who understood it. It was all the wrong people understood it, and all the people who should have known it. All the Jews who should have known it, they didn't say anything about it. In fact, it was the audience knew about it from chapter 1 and verse 1. We saw that the demon-possessed people knew about it. Okay, God knew about it because God explained it at Jesus' baptism and at the transfiguration. And the centurion knew about it. But the disciples never made any of those confessions, okay? But of course, it's important for Matthew to emphasize that Jesus is the Son of God because that means that he really is the Messiah. I mean, it's part of his argument in the midst of the debates that Matthew's followers are dealing with, okay? So Matthew also appears to emphasize against his Jewish debate partners that Jesus is the Messianic and royal Son of God, okay? In chapter... There's no, we can read through all of this here. Okay, but in chapter 1 and verse 1, Matthew begins, all these references, by the way, are in Matthew. It says that the genealogy of Jesus Christ, who is the son of David, son of Abraham, but he is still the son in particular, pointing out it is important from the beginning. We already saw in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 15, the reference to Hosea, out of Egypt I have called my son. Let's see. In chapter 4, this is where Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, by the devil, by Satan. And the temptation is always, if you are the Son of God, do this, okay? And there's a double temptation here. It says in 4 and verse 3 and in chapter 4 and verse 6, if you are the Son of God. You need to remember that the devil tempts him, if you are the Son of God, twice here. Just remember that there's a double temptation, okay? Okay. Actually, let me have somebody read this one. Can somebody read? I'll just call a new volunteer here. Can somebody read chapter 14 and verse 33?
I can do it. 14:33. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God."
Yeah, okay. So there we actually have the disciples giving a positive confession of Jesus being the Son of God, okay? Now, if you go back and look at Mark, you're not going to see that, okay? The point is Matthew is trying to hammer this point so much stronger than Mark, okay? It's an emphasis in Mark, but Mark's emphasis is that the Jews don't get it and the Gentiles do. Matthew's emphasis is that Jesus is the Son of God and everyone and their mother is going to confess it, okay? Let's also read this one here in Matthew 16, verse 16.
Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God."
That's right. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, if you read just Mark's version, Peter is simply going to say, "You are the Christ," period. Okay, but Matthew wants to emphasize that that the Christ means Son of God, Son of the living God, and so that fuller confession is given in Matthew. Okay, but Peter actually calls Jesus the Son of God there, but you wouldn't see that if you only read Mark. Okay, now in Matthew chapter 27, Jesus is he's on the cross and he's being mocked by people around the cross, and twice he gets mocked by saying, "If you're really the Son of God, come on down off the cross." And I think that double temptation is an echo of the double temptation that we saw earlier with Satan in Matthew chapter 4. So here we see another double temptation. If you're really the Son of God, don't do what the Son of God is supposed to do, which is to die for the sins of the world. So I think that that's a deliberate literary piece that Matthew is making. The temptation of Satan reappears with the mockers. Okay, and we also, if Jesus is the Son of God, then the Son obviously has a Father, and Matthew places a heavy emphasis on God as Father. So I just did a word study on Father. Okay, notice in Matthew, Father occurs 99 times. Okay, 9% by the way of the entire Bible. Okay, but if you look down at Mark at the very bottom, 19 times. Okay, is that a big difference going from 19 to 99? That's plus 400%. That's a big deal, okay? So it's very clear in Matthew that Matthew wants to make the point that God is the Father and Jesus is the Son. And so you'll see phrase of Jesus, he'll say the Father, or my Father who is in heaven, or our Father who is in heaven. But calling God Father is a major emphasis in Matthew. Again, 99 times compared to Mark, which is only 19. You know, a 400% difference. I mean, it just jumps off the chart there. You can see that. Okay. Running out of time here, so let me just quickly speed through this. So last thing I kind of want to point out here is that Matthew seems to be directed as a gospel directed towards Gentile faith, despite the overwhelming emphasis on the Jewish concerns within Matthew, which I hope we've already seen. Jesus is the new Moses, Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel's scriptures, and Jesus is the Son of God. It also appears to be deliberately written to encourage Gentile faith. Okay, very first verse talks about how Jesus is the son of Abraham, and it begins by noting that Jesus himself is descended from Abraham, who is a Gentile. Okay, that's important. In the genealogy, in these 4 verses, all the women mentioned prior to Mary, we have Rahab, we have Bathsheba, and 2 others, were actually non-Israelites, indicating that Gentiles played an instrumental role in Jesus' birth. Okay. In chapter 2 and verse 1 and 2 and verse 16, we see that these magi from the east, these Gentiles, they come and they worship Jesus while the Jewish king tried to kill him. Well, that's pretty sad. You would think that the Jews would want to worship Jesus, but it's actually the Gentiles who come and worship Jesus. Okay. In chapter 3, verses 8 through 9, this is the preaching of John the Baptist. This passage has John the Baptist saying, therefore bear fruits in keeping with repentance, and do not claim to say among yourselves that we have Abraham as our father, because God can raise up children of Abraham from rocks. This actually is a pun in Hebrew, because the word for sons is the word ben, B-E-N, and the word for rocks is the word eben, E-B-E-N. And so he says, don't think that you can claim to be sons, ben, because God can raise them up from rocks, eben. So it's a pun that was actually understood in the ancient language. And so John the Baptist is saying, hey, don't think that your ethnic boasting, that you're a child of Abraham, means anything. If you're not bearing any fruit, it doesn't really matter. And so we're going to see in Matthew's gospel that it doesn't really matter if you're a Jew or not. What really matters is, are you bearing fruit? Are you being faithful? Are you being obedient? In chapter 8, verses 11 through 12, this is where the centurion comes and says, oh, Jesus, you don't have to come to my house. Just say the word and my servant or my son will be healed. And Jesus says, I have not seen this faith in all of Israel. He says, truly I say to you, many will come from the east and the west and dine with Abraham in the kingdom of God, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown out. So he actually says Gentile faith is praised, and people are going to come from the east and the west, and they're going to sit at the Messianic banquet. Chapter 10 and verse 8, or 10:18. Let me actually have somebody read this passage, please. 10:18.
I'll read that.
Okay.
10:18. And you will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles.
All right, as a testimony to the Gentiles, the 12 whom Jesus sent out would be. Okay, he sends out the 12 in Matthew chapter 10, and he says, you're going to be there as a testimony to Gentiles. Despite the fact that earlier in chapter 10, Jesus says, you're primarily to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So yes, the original purpose was to go to Israel only, but eventually this mission would be expanded, and you would be speaking to Gentiles, just as Jesus spoke to Gentiles 2 chapters earlier. Okay, I already had somebody read this passage. This is where Jesus is the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 42, where the Gentiles will hope in Jesus. It actually says that twice in the passage in Isaiah. Here's another one. Let me have somebody read this passage in chapter 12, verses 41 through 42. Please.
Lisa's going to read it.
Hold on a second. Find it. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at Jonah's proclamation. And look, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear wisdom, the wisdom of Solomon. And look, something greater than Solomon is here.
Right. Notice Jesus here is saying that, he's saying, by the way, at the resurrection, okay, these Gentiles from Nineveh and this Gentile queen from the south are going to be raised up, and they're going to judge this generation. This generation, by the way, is the generation of unbelieving Jews. I mean, Jesus here is saying something really radical. He's saying Gentiles are going to be raised up, and they're going to judge Jews. I mean, he's praising Gentiles because they responded appropriately to the preaching of the prophets, to the preaching of Solomon. I mean, it's a very radical thing for the Jewish Messiah to say that Gentiles will be judging Jews. But that's what he does there. Okay? In chapter 13, this is one of the parables. It's the parable of some people call it the tares and the wheat. But in I can't just abbreviate this. Okay, let me have somebody read these two passages, these two verses, 37 through 38 out of chapter 13.
I got it.
Okay.
He answered, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one.
Yeah, okay, so Jesus is the one who's preaching. He's sowing the seed. It's the entire world is the field, And you got two different kinds of seeds. The sons of the kingdom and the sons of the devil, sons of the evil one. You got two different kinds of people in this world. Those who have responded to Jesus' message of the kingdom and those who haven't. But the field is the entire world, okay? Not just Israel, not just Palestine, not just the Holy Land, the entire world, okay? In this parable, which there's no way we can read the entire thing, it actually stems for the first 16 verses in chapter 20. This is where the landowner sends out and invites people to work in the vineyard. And he's got in the first hour, he invites some people. In the third hour, he invites some people. In the ninth hour, he invites some people. In the 11th hour, he invites some other people on the road. And he says, how come you're not working in the field? And these people in the 11th hour say, we've never been invited. No one's ever asked us. And so they get invited. But when it comes time for them to get paid, the last people get paid first. Well, whenever there's a parable about an owner of a vineyard, the owner of the vineyard is God. The vineyard is Israel, and they're always supposed to be producing fruit, okay? And so the people who have never been invited, you wouldn't say those are Jews, because Jews have certainly been invited to work in the field. That's what the law is. People that have never been invited are Gentiles. But what Jesus is actually saying in this is that Gentiles who come in and they work, even though that they come temporally last within the history of God, because Jews were invited first. The Israelites were invited first. They're actually going to be repaid first. And then Jesus says the point of this is that the first will be last and the last will be first. It's a very cryptic way of saying that that Gentiles will be allowed to work for the owner of the vineyard, which is God. And then chapter 24 and verse 14, Jesus says, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all the nations. Okay? Not just to Israel, not just to Jews, to the entire world as a testimony to the nations, and then the end will come. And then, of course, the final word in the book of Matthew is that disciples are to make disciples out of all nations, the same word for Gentiles. Point being is that Matthew seems to be very interested in encouraging Gentile faith. It was not just solely written to Jewish believers. It was written first to Jews, but that was later expanded to Gentiles. And basically, it's just to anybody who's going to bear fruit and anybody who's going to show faith. Okay? So, in conclusion, drawing conclusions. Here's the end, and then I'll shut up. Okay. Number one, and this, of course, is drawing on everything we've looked at, stemming all the way back to Wednesday. Number one, Matthew drew upon Mark's written gospel as his primary source for Jesus' material. Number two, as an eyewitness, Matthew the apostle expanded upon Mark's material while maintaining Mark's core story. We saw that Matthew used 94% of Mark's story while adding Matthew's own distinctive emphases, resurrection appearances, the birth narratives, genealogy, etc. Number three, Matthew's gospel seeks to encourage his Christian community after the temple's destruction from the slanders and the attacks of the new leadership of Judaism, namely the Pharisaic rabbis. The apologetic and polemical emphases become primary interpretive features for Matthew. I cannot stress that enough. The apologetic and polemical emphases become primary interpretive features for Matthew. Number four, to answer his Jewish critics, Matthew portrays Jesus as the new and authoritative Moses. Number five, Matthew also argues against his Jewish critics by displaying Jesus as the repeated fulfillment of Israel's scriptures. Okay, we saw that, I think, what it does in references. Number six, lastly, Jesus is displayed in Matthew as seeking disciples from anyone willing to bear fruit, whether Jew or Gentile. Okay, I will stop sharing my screen here, catch my breath, and let people ask questions. Sorry for the marathon.
Michelle has her hand up.
Okay.
You had mentioned that one of the apostles was a zealot. Which one?
Say what?
You had mentioned that one of the apostles was a zealot, and I, kind of forgot which one was it.
Let me look that. I think it was, wasn't his name Simon?
Yeah, I think it was the other Simon.
Yeah, so look at Matthew chapter 10 and verse 4. It says his name is Simon the Zealot.
Okay.
Okay. What's interesting is that a zealot is someone who hates Rome with a passion to the point to where they're willing to assassinate and murder them. Okay. On the contrary, you've also got the author of Matthew being a tax collector, someone who says, I'm going to work for Rome and make money. So let me ask you, do you think originally did Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector get along? Probably not. They disagreed very significantly on politics and religion. Nothing else has changed in our world. Anyway, but the point is, Simon gave up being a zealot and Matthew gave up being a tax collector, and they became followers of Jesus. All right.
Can I say
Next question.
Well, all I can say is, wow. I'm going to be watching this video over and over again and taking notes. I feel a little bit like the two guys with Jesus on the road to Emmaus. I mean, this is all stuff that I never understood before, and I feel like, wow, you're really opening up the scriptures to me, the Gospels to me, and I had not ever been taught or understood any of this stuff. Thank you, Dustin.
Thanks for staying awake.
Yeah, I echo Lisa's praise, Dustin. Man, what a difference an explanation makes when you just don't know. You try your best, but I was never taught this stuff, or maybe I didn't read the right books or something. I'm not blaming anybody, but thanks for the insight, your time, your energy, your ministry. Very grateful for you, Dustin.
Well, my encouragement is that anybody can sit down and pick up Matthew and really come up with most of this stuff on their own. I'm not giving any sort of secret insight or magical knowledge or anything. I'm not, and hardly anything that I told you today is anything that I found out on my own. I got this all from reading other people. So,
but honestly, Dustin, this has to be pointed out. Things have to be pointed out for us to see these things, and you did a great job in doing that.
As, what you were sharing about the original audience and, what the purposes were and all of that stuff. I don't know that somebody could necessarily determine that, just, figure it out on their own.
Well, you know why that is? It's because people don't approach the Gospels as Greco-Roman biographies. They don't read them in an appropriate way to their literary genre. They don't understand what that literary genre is, and thereby they accidentally, I'm going to say they do it out of ignorance, they misread it, or they don't understand. But that, I tell you, that emphasis that Matthew has written, after the destruction of the temple, dealing with the arguments of the Pharisees, every single one of the Matthew commentaries written today says that, all of them. That is the consensus of scholarship. That is what all of the experts are saying, whether they're conservative or liberal or anywhere in between. That is, that's common knowledge out there. So,
thanks. Yeah.
Julie had her hand up.
Okay.
Okay, hear me. It was a wonderful teaching. I just ditto everything that everybody said. But I had a question. This is at the very start when John said the Word of God, and you said something about they're called the Scriptures. Will you tell me what that was about?
Yeah. Okay. So very, very briefly, in the New Testament, when you see the word "word," it almost always, 99% of the time, refers to the gospel message or the spoken gospel message, the saving gospel message. Okay. But a lot of people today, they think the Word is this thing right here. Okay. The Bible never, ever, 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 ever refers to itself as the Word. But I keep hearing people say that, and I just have to. I know that people say like, working the Word for themselves. I'm thinking, how do you work the gospel for yourself? It doesn't make any sense. But that's not how the Bible uses its own language. When the Bible wants to refer to itself, it'll call itself the Scriptures or the writings. But the Word in the New Testament, in 99% of its occurrences, refers to the spoken gospel message, and we should not confuse the two of those. But it's a mistake that a lot of people do, so
okay,
it's trying to help us to adopt biblical language.
Well, I think we need to be correct, and that's why I wanted to know. That's great.
When I first heard Dustin say that some time ago, my first thought was that
skepticism.
Well, not skepticism. I just thought, that doesn't seem very important. That seems like a distinction without any kind of need to make a distinction. And but then after he taught that, what I started to see was how the problem with not making the distinction is that sometimes we'll be reading in the New Testament and we'll read the phrase Word of God and we'll be thinking the Bible and not thinking the gospel. And that's the problem with not getting that down is the fact that there are times when it's referring to the gospel, and that's really important in the context of what's being said.
Yeah.
Well, I think that I wanted to say that because I think it is very important, what he was just explaining. And what I also think is that maybe somehow the adversary, by getting people to think of the word referring to the whole scriptures rather than the gospel, it has covered up the message of the kingdom.
That's exactly. Oh my gosh.
To me, that is why it's so important to
I think Justin's excited about
That's exactly it. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Well, yeah,
Right.
because the scriptures, you need to use the terminology correct, but I really think the adversary has used that, and so he's taken that so that the word is referred to the whole scriptures, and like I said, the message of the gospel has been covered up and lost, and now people think they're going to heaven, and it's just from a tactic of the adversary, So.
Donna Catulli has her hand up.
Okay. Hi, Donna.
Hi, Dustin. Great stuff here. Well, that was exactly what I was going to ask in the sower and the seed. To be more precise, so little is taught on the kingdom of God. I mean, after I pick my jaw up off the floor here, because it's that vital. And my heart bleeds for the people that have been taught religious stuff. I don't accuse them or blame them. I was one of them. Seriously, I was. And for years, I don't know where my head was, but you can only guess where it was. Not in the right place. So, sometimes we do need to come across, a great teacher, and the people it's hard for people to conclude if they're, if the banter is heaven, 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 clouds, angels, that kind of stuff. And I was floored when I learned about the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. I literally cried a million tears because, so many, I think God works with people where they're at. He understands your troubled waters. He understands you don't understand. And if you keep going, but boy, I wish somebody would just step out. And I think more people are stepping out of the audience of the heaven thing and teaching the kingdom of God. I notice more and more men around the globe are teaching a kingdom, planting the seed about the kingdom of God rather than, this heaven thing floating on some cloud with some kind of cigar. I don't know. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, we could talk about the kingdom all day long, but I would like to do that, but I want to make sure I get all the questions answered.
Greg had his hand up.
Okay.
Well, I was just thinking it was in reference to what you said about the scriptures, in Acts 17:11, where the Bereans searched the scriptures. Doesn't say the word.
Yeah, actually, that passage says that Paul spoke the word to them, and they searched the scripture to see what he's saying is true. So it actually uses both things I'm trying to distinguish. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, try that out for you.
It seemed like, I've only barely just had a little inkling of understanding or scratch, not really even scratch the surface on some of these ideas, like new perspective on Paul's stuff, but it seemed like maybe I detected a little bit of stuff in here that would hint at, because you were talking about the interpretation of Judaism or something, the correct interpretation of Judaism. The new perspective on Paul has to do with that what we have thought of what the Jews thought about Judaism is not correct, right? And
yeah, by we, it's Protestants for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And so we just, but here, and I mean, this is a little kind of outside our scope here, but we need to understand that Judaism in the first century was not a monolithic thing. What I mean by that is there was not one particular thing you can look at and say, this is Judaism. Because if you were to ask, what does it mean to be a faithful Jew? The Pharisees would tell you one thing. The Sadducees would tell you something else. The Essenes would tell you something else. The followers of John the Baptist would tell you something differently, okay? So you've got different competing interpretations as to what does it mean to be a good Jew? How do you interpret the law? And so we have to take those things seriously. It's just basically we're not setting up a straw man and knocking it down. And for a long time, Christians have been taught, oh, Christianity is great and Judaism is bad. And so we become anti-Semitic. We become anti-Jewish. Christians stop reading their Old Testament. We thought that we demonized the Pharisees, despite the fact that Paul was a Pharisee. We forget that. And we do that wrongly. There were Pharisees that converted and were Christians. We see that in Acts 15. We see that in Philippians chapter 3. Anyway, so that's all that I'm saying is we got to take all the evidence seriously, whether historically, whether culturally, whether from a literary standpoint. You've got to take all the evidence seriously. If you leave evidence out, we're not going to get a full picture of what's happening, and we're likely going to misunderstand what's taking place. Unfortunately, taking all the evidence seriously requires a lot of work. So I don't have all the answers figured out. I'm sure 5 years from now, I'm going to realize something I told you was wrong, and I'm going to feel really bad. I misquoted that verse in Matthew 14.
Kenny and Laura have their hand up.
Okay.
Hey, I just, it's interesting stuff. I hadn't heard some of that and seen those parallels drawn before, so it's really cool. You mentioned you had got most of that from other books and such. Is there a book that would be written to more of laymen that kind of shows the same information you're sharing this morning that I could share with other people?
Oh boy. Let me get back to you on that. Well, it depends on where you define a layman. I don't know. I don't know. I'm really going to think about that for a while and get back to you on what would be a good thing.
Okay, thanks.
I think a good place to start, people, would be to get a really a good Bible dictionary, a good modern Bible dictionary. As I'm sitting there trying to think, like, what is a good, like, one-volume Bible dictionary? I can't think of one. Okay. Here's. Hold on. Okay. Here's a good place to start. The Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. Okay, it's just one dictionary of things having to do with Jesus and the Gospels. Okay, it's published by IVP. Okay, if you look on Amazon, you will see that there is a second edition. I think either edition are fine, but that's a good place. It'll have articles on everything having to do with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. The whole, thick little thing, written, I think, for a layman's terms. You could learn a lot from a Bible dictionary. I know most people don't like to read dictionaries for fun. I have read some dictionaries for fun, learned a lot of things. Most of the best Bible dictionaries are multi-volume ones that will cost you a few $100s. But
can you hold that book up again?
Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. The editors are Joel Green and Scott McKnight. It's InterVarsity Press. So anyway, that just popped off my head. Good place to start. So, okay. Any other questions?
So a lot of the things that you would learn, like you shared today, would come out of commentaries and other research works, not typically going to be like layman's type books.
Well, I mean, a couple of times I put up, the diagrams of the word studies. I mean, anyone can go through and see that stuff. Anyone can go through and count the number of times that Pharisees show up, the number of times that Father shows up. I I mean, anyone could have done that.
Right.
I just did that off BibleWorks, and I just copy and pasted it, just to kind of prove it to people. I don't know. I mean, my best piece of advice to people is to read critically.
Yeah,
Read critically. Ask questions. Don't believe what anyone tells you. Figure it out for yourself. Ask questions, and be willing to question everything. Really, you shouldn't just be blindly accepting what I tell you. Like you should be reading everything I'm saying with a skeptical eye and saying, what is this person trying to pull on me?
Yeah, I've been trying that a lot, doing that a lot more lately too, where I actually read the scriptures and I try to think, what is this actually saying? Not what somebody else told me it says, with a conscious attempt to see it, just what does it say, not filter it through something else that I've taught, or maybe that I've even thought, my preconceptions that I'm coming to it with. And I've just started noticing that I see a lot of things that I did not see before.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, they read through the Gospels or they read through the New Testament, and they'll come across something that they don't understand, and they'll say, I don't understand what this means. And they'll skip over it and they'll keep reading instead of stopping and trying to figure out an answer for that. And then after a while, they've got 100 things that they don't understand, and then they wonder why they don't understand what the book is saying, or it doesn't make sense, or it doesn't fit. I think there's a lot of resources out there, and anyway, I
can tell you, in answer to your question, Kenny, one of the things that I have valued is building a good set of commentaries. And what I mean by a good set of commentaries is getting the best available commentary or commentaries on a particular book of the Bible. So rather than building a commentary set from a particular publisher, an editor, a series, I like using Amazon reviews and just going through, and if I'm going to study a particular book of the Bible, I'll go and I'll start to look at the reviews of commentaries of that book. And what I found is that you get lots of really helpful information, because what will happen is people in those reviews, especially people who are professionals writing those reviews, they'll talk about other commentaries. Mm-hmm. And so you go and you read the reviews of those commentaries. And if you spend an hour or so, or whatever, reading through those reviews, what ends up happening is you start to see a consensus about the value of different commentaries, where you'll start to see a particular commentary. Everybody generally likes that commentary for, practical use in sermons, for example. Or you'll see people talking about how, Douglas Moo's commentary of such and such is the very best modern commentary on the subject. And you'll see,
he shakes his head no.
and you see like a dozen people talking about that, or whoever. Moo's come to mind, F.F. Bruce, or whoever, and so you start to see some consensus on some things, and you'll also see people arguing about it, right? And you'll start to see kind of where people are coming from. Well, you do that for a little while, and you'll start to see, I think I'd like to get X commentary for the book of Matthew or the book of Acts, or
now the thing is that commentaries do take up a lot of space, and they're expensive. They're many volumes and that kind of
that's
thing.
That's why I've been building my commentary sets for 20 years, and so they're about $35 or so for a single volume, and so you're just building it over time. It's not that bad.
If you need recommendations for New Testament commentaries, I'd be happy to give some of those, in particular, but just not now.
and commentaries are written by scholars who have PhDs, right?
That teach in universities. Like they're not written by just Joe Schmo in their in their basement. I mean, people that are well trained, they're peer reviewed, they've got an editorial board. I mean, they're.
Yeah, and I've always found that, the ones that I like the best are the commentators who will give you all the views on a subject fairly. And, they'll say there's 3 or 4 different ways of interpreting this passage. Here's the 3 or 4 different ways. They'll tell you which one they think is right. But they'll also reference other books on, for other people that are giving those different views. You just get a nice broad spectrum.
Anybody else have questions regarding the teaching? I know we're going kind of long, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time.
Just a really good teaching, Dustin. Excellent work.
The commentaries on Bible Hub they excerpts from the quality. Those are not the same quality. Okay.
No. If you have nothing else to go to, maybe. But I hate to say this, but like when it comes to commentaries, you get what you pay for. If they're free, they might not have, they tend to not be as honest. So
the problem with older commentaries too, Michelle, is
it's out of copyright stuff that's going to be free, right?
A lot of the time, yeah. And the problem with older commentaries is there was so much that those commentators didn't have access to. It doesn't mean that they're not invaluable. I have frequently found, John Calvin's commentaries to be helpful, and it doesn't mean that they don't have any value at all. But the problem is that it's like the stuff we were talking about, the new perspectives on Paul. If you read a commentary before, say, the 1980s, you're not going to get that information. Well, that's critical information, because the Protestant church, like Dustin said, for hundreds of years has assumed a particular view of what the Jews of Jesus' time believed, and read that into what Paul was writing. And what modern scholars discovered, as more and more writings were uncovered by the Second Temple Jews, they discovered that wasn't at all what they believed. Just a very quick example is the Protestant church has taught that the Jews of the time believed that salvation was by works. And so Paul is arguing against that salvation is by grace. Well, now we know that's not true. The Jews at the time believed that salvation was by grace. And so, well, wait a minute. If the Jews believed that salvation was by grace, what the heck is Paul talking about? Well, that's what the whole new perspective on Paul is about. And there's a lot on there. There's gigantic volumes written about that. And so if you're reading a commentary prior to, again, about the 1980s, 90s, roughly, you're not going to get that. Well, that's a good example of the problem with older commentaries. Well, why don't we close up with a prayer?
I'm going to stop the recording here.